Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Happy Saturday, everybody. I hope you're all having a restful weekend. There is just so much to cover from this week that we will be doing an episode today as well as tomorrow. Both episodes will focus on foreign affairs and the economy. For today, we begin with developments in EU-China relations. This week, Li Hui, PRC Special Envoy for the Ukraine crisis, had a series of meetings with EU officials to discuss the war. And it sounds like the talks were quite tough. In a series of meetings on Monday and Tuesday, EU representatives were treated to a, quote, full dose of Moscow's talking points, end quote, in the words of one source speaking to Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post. China claims to be a neutral player in the conflict, but is seen by the US and its European allies to have sided with Russia. Li reportedly told EU officials that no discussion on Ukraine's territorial integrity would take place until the violence stops, which he said could only happen when the EU stops sending weapons to Ukraine. As you could probably tell, this did not go down well in Europe. The European External Action Service, the diplomatic service and combined foreign and defense ministry of the European Union, expressed that in some of these meetings the EU highlighted that Russia's war is an existential threat for its security and that therefore China's position on the war inevitably impacts the bilateral relationship. The EU expects China, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, to play a constructive role and to use every occasion to uphold and promote the UN Charter and international law, and it stressed it expects China to call on Russia to respect the principles of sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity immediately. The EU also reiterated, according to the document, its serious concerns regarding significant volumes of dual-use and advanced technology items being exported from China to Russia's military-industrial complex. For his part, Li Hui said the meetings went well, but added that China firmly opposes the EU's inclusion of Chinese enterprises in the latest list of sanctions against Russia, urging the EU to, quote, unconditionally cancel the listing of Chinese enterprises and return to the right track of dialogue and consultation with China, end quote. Meanwhile, this week, US outlet Politico reports that the European People's Party, EPP, the frontrunner in June's European Parliament poll, headed by Ursula von der Leyen, has become increasingly critical of China. The past 5 years, the EU has made drastic geostrategic readjustments on China, especially after the Russian war against Ukraine. The outlet adds, quote, this week the EPP shows that, contrary to a widely shared belief in Beijing, this toughness is not just about von der Leyen's views, but can be seen front and center in the party's core thinking, end quote. In a final draft of the party's manifesto, the EPP makes more than a dozen mentions of China and Taiwan, compared with 10 Russia references. Quote, for the EPP, the EU's biggest trade enemy is now officially China. Saying that it would like to trade with the entire world, it adds that European countries should foster a special cooperation with like-minded partners in the Union of Democracies to remain competitive vis-a-vis dominant competitors such as China, end quote. In the most recent edition of the Watching China in Europe newsletter, senior advisor with Rhodium Group's China practice, Noah Barkin, observed a similar hardening of attitudes across the EU, writing this week, quote, there is a clear understanding in Paris of what is at stake. If we submit to China, it will be the end of the European car industry, the senior French official told me. Europe can't shy away from taking action out of fear of Chinese retaliation, the official added. But there still appears to be a disconnect between the Commission and Germany, whose car makers fear that China's anti-dumping investigation into French brandy is just an appetite before they are served up with the main course. Scholz must avoid, during his April 15th to 16th trip to Beijing, the trap that Merkel fell into over a decade ago, when she torpedoed a Commission trade case against China on solar panels during a visit by Chinese Premier Li Keqiang in Berlin. The Chinese side will put enormous pressure on Scholz to repudiate the EU measures, said a German industry official who supports the Commission's trade moves. It would be an absolute disaster if he bowed to the pressure, the official added, end quote. And on this topic, the European Union is moving closer to imposing additional tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles entering the bloc, citing new proof that the government in Beijing is providing illegal financial support for the industry. This week, the European Commission, the EU's executive arm, said it had found, quote, sufficient evidence, end quote, that the imports of new battery electric vehicles from China received subsidies, including direct transfers of funds, tax breaks, or public provision of goods and services below market prices. US outlet Bloomberg reports that in recent probes of other sectors such as e-bikes and fiber optic cables, the EU discovered subsidy margins ranging from 4 to 17%. Quote, the investigation is part of a broader EU effort to protect supply lines and bring production closer to home, particularly in key sectors such as semiconductors and pharmaceuticals, end quote, the outlet adds. According to the new European Commission report, it found evidence of, quote, massive imports of the Chinese vehicles in a relatively short period of time, including a substantial increase of 14% since the investigation was launched compared with a year before, end quote. Adding, quote, at this stage it is possible that, on the basis of the data collected during the investigation, the injury, which would be difficult to repair, started to materialize even before the end of the investigation, end quote. The Bloomberg piece explains that if the EU does impose duties, it would curtail one of the last major markets for Chinese EV exports and raises the prospect of a cascade of defensive moves in places such as the UK to protect their markets from being flooded by vehicles redirected from the EU. China exported about $12.7 billion of electric vehicles to the EU in 2023 through November. This is all part of a general backlash against rising Chinese trade surpluses with the developed world in recent years. And this is the theme which we move on to next. But just quickly, if you're enjoying today's episode of China Update, it's a huge help if you can hit the like button. Liking and subscribing are the only ways in which the channel can grow, and is a huge help for me. And for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable, I rely primarily on subscriber support to keep going. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Next up, China's exports started the year on strong footing. According to data released Thursday by Beijing's General Administration of Customs, which is typically quite accurate as it can be checked on the other side of each trade, in the first 2 months of 2024, Chinese exports rose to 3.75 trillion RMB, a year-on-year increase of 10.3% in RMB terms and 7.1% in US dollar terms. Imports rose to 2.86 trillion yuan, or 6.7% in RMB terms and 3.5% in US terms. The net impact was a trade surplus of 890 billion RMB, equal to roughly 4.5% of China's GDP. Taken as a whole, Chinese exports to the US rebounded to 5% growth in the January through February period from a 6.9% decline in December. Beijing combines economic data for the first 2 months of the year to iron out distortions caused by shifts in the timing of the Lunar New Year holiday. US-based The Wall Street Journal writes that while the increase was comfortably higher than the 3% increase expected by economists surveyed earlier this year, the market was prepared for the strong reading after senior Chinese officials disclosed the data 1 day ahead of the scheduled release. Some argue that the faster-than-expected growth of China's export sector in January and February at least gives Beijing some stability in the shorter term. Is this the case? Well, Zhang Zhiwei, president and chief economist at Pinpoint Asset Management, expressed on the numbers, quote, China is moving up the value chain. This will likely strengthen policymakers' confidence in China's economy, end quote. Others have cooler views, however. Ding Shuang, a China economist for Standard Chartered Bank, told clients, quote, the Chinese economy is big. It's hard to rely on external demand to totally offset the weakness in domestic demand, end quote. And Eric Zhu, a Bloomberg economist, similarly observed, quote, China's stronger-than-expected exports in the first 2 months of 2024 point to some support for the economy, but external demand is unlikely to be a reliable crutch for growth, given the slowing global economy and elevated geopolitical risks. Base effects will also turn less favorable in the coming months, tugging down export growth, end quote. And some even argue that the data are a troubling sign. Quote, most analysts in the press are treating the stronger-than-expected trade numbers as good news for the economy. I see things differently. Export growth was nearly 4 times what the market expected, while import growth was a little more than twice expectations. What that tells us is that demand in China is still seriously underperforming supply. This makes Chinese growth more reliant than ever on favorable external conditions. This may seem like a good thing for mercantilists, who assume that the purpose of trade is to generate larger and larger surpluses. But surpluses are just the reverse of weak domestic demand. Healthy Chinese growth this year requires stable or growing exports and a contracting trade surplus, i.e. a reduced Chinese reliance on external demand for growth. This may happen over the rest of 2024, but it certainly isn't happening yet. End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Like I said, there will be an extra episode tomorrow. So I hope you have a good Saturday, and I will see you all tomorrow.